the process of building an agent is kind of like building a product. And that actually like goes deeper than in the surface. The analogy that I use is like Google in its early days, they not only built a great product in their search engine, but they also got really good at building internet scale products. I think the same is going to be true for agents. Specifically at Sierra, we're not only sort of building AI agents for our customers, we're also investing in building the tools and processes and ultimately a product that is the best way to build the best agents. But sort of like the first derivative of a great agent is a great product and building agents. So that's how you and I initially met. As part of that is in the evaluation, which is a very important step in building the tooling for having a great agent.
Today, we're talking with Arya Asemanfar, who leads product engineering at Sierra.ai. They are building agents for companies for customer service, other ways of engaging with their customers, and have really been at the front lines of figuring out, what does it look like to make agents work well for enterprise use cases. So we're going to get into a lot more detail today with what they've built, how they've gone about both thinking about agents and their process for working with customers and bringing this kind of custom AI functionality to life for their customers, as well as like what they've built on the platform side, how they make their systems work from observability to evals to testing, and some of Arya's advice for other builders. With that, we'll jump right in. Appreciate you listening. Hey, everybody. I'm joined here today with Arya Asemanfar from Sierra, and we're going to talk about what they're building with enterprise agents. And we'll let him tell you more what that means. But Arya, why don't you just quick give us an intro, like who you are, what you're working on, and maybe some perspective on why we're talking today, and we'll jump in from there.
My name is Arya. I lead the product engineering team at Sierra. I was one of the first engineers on the team, and I played a role in making our earliest customers successful all the way to now, where we've scaled the team and have tons of agents in the wild. As Ian mentioned, we're building company agents. So it's worth teasing that apart a little bit, though, since it's fairly new to the world.
Please. Yep. I think a lot of people are wanting that teased apart these days.
Yeah. So if you think about your experience today, nearly every business you interact with has some online presence, like usually a mobile app or a website. For example, earlier today, I ordered lunch through DoorDash, and through a couple dozen taps and swipes, I found the right restaurant, picked what I wanted, got some lunch and time to eat before this recording. With that framing in mind, I think what we're building at Sierra is kind of simple. We want to take that interaction and elevate it by leveraging AI-powered agents to make it fast, intuitive, and delightful. So if you think about this lunch example in the future, I should just be able to have a quick conversation like, hey, I've got a podcast recording at 12:30. I need to eat lunch before that. So I'd love to have some tacos no later than 12. Thank you. And maybe through a quick back and forth, be done with it. It's not just like basics like this lunch example. I think really any interaction that you have with a business online can and should feel a lot more straightforward than it does today. And we believe at Sierra that AI-powered agents can deliver that for consumers.
No, that's awesome. And I think, I've been aware of you all since the beginning, know some of your customers, for people that are not as close, maybe even just starting with agents, right? There's a lot of buzzwords in the AI ecosystem. Agents are the current one in, I think, a lot of the zeitgeist. Can you just help us anchor for people that are listening, like, sounds cool, what exactly do you mean? What's different about agents versus RAG chatbots, for instance, that came before them? Let's start there, and then we can talk and maybe like hear some examples about what you're actually building for people.
I think it's a good question. Yeah, agents is definitely like thrown around as a buzzword. There's probably like a more academic answer, but I think practically for me, the difference is sort of, can it take action? Does it have agency to do something for you as the consumer interacting with it? So if you squint, like a RAG chatbot agent kind of just looks like a fancy search engine, right? It's taking your question and giving you an answer. Maybe the answer is personalized and unique each time you ask. To some extent, search engines have started to do that already. Whereas an agent is actually has, I guess coming from the word agency, has the power to do something, and usually on behalf of a consumer or a company. And so I think ultimately the ability to take action and have an effect out in the world is what makes something an agent.
And when you think about it, if you define it that way, like if we get kind of more brass tacks technical definition, is this as simple as in that definition, you can take a right action, to another API, like you have access to a tool that will do something other than just look up data. Is that the nuance, the way that you're describing it?
Technically, yes, but if you just try to do that in the sort of the simple, simple way where you give access to the LLM to make API calls, you're just not going to get the reliability and the behavior that you want. And so ultimately, I think what ends up happening when you try to build an agent using AI that's going to work at scale, you have to create an architecture around it. This is probably true even for non-agents, right? If you're going to stand up a business, like technically you can set up a lemonade stand and have a business going. But to have that actually be efficient and scale and make sense, you got to create processes, and you got to figure out how to have this be repeatable, have it be profitable and all that. So similarly with agents, I think your technical definition of it has access, right access is probably right. But in order to do so reliably, you end up having to create an architecture around it.
Yeah, I think we get a mix of people listening to this show, people like yourself that are actually building these things for real, leaders at companies that are thinking about building these kinds of things. And I think that's one of the, in practice, we'll probably get into it more, but it's like, cool, taking action in the world, but the architecture around it often involves some amount of like self-reflection or, self-critique. And there's, these other steps that we'll get into. Would love to hear more about how you're building in a couple of minutes to just help anchor it even a little bit further. What are some examples of agentic behavior that you've built for customers? You don't need to give us customer specific examples, names or whatever, but just give us a sense of what does Sierra help people do in the world?
So we initially started with customer service. So customer service being, let's use the retailer example. You purchase something and you need to exchange it for a different size, or maybe you have a question about how to set up some consumer device. Since customer service is already chat based, it's kind of a no brainer, right? Often you might be waiting in line to talk to a human. But if you can get that experience both immediately as well as effectively where it solves your problem, it's just a better customer experience. What we've done for a lot of our customers is take their customer service and built an AI agent that can deliver that experience for their consumers, and that spans from retailers to subscription businesses to consumer electronics. I think there's a bunch of customers on our website if you want to dig into some case studies.
Sure.
But it's currently largely in the customer service space.
If you take examples, it's like I'm going to help initiate a return, right? Like you're getting all the way into these companies' actual business processes and other systems. How do those integrations come to life? Just be cool to hear you talk about more like what are the parts of the Sierra platform and how you work with the customer to make those real when it's a very, unique process for each business.
That's a good, insightful question. I think that uniqueness is actually one of the pieces that we learned about early on, is that really every company has a unique brand as well as a unique set of processes that they want
Yep.
to embody. If you think about even just like sort of taking the analogy back to websites, and now everyone has a website, and especially retailers, they can stand up retail e-commerce sites on Shopify very easily, and it's always customized. If you go back like 20 years, none of that was possible. There was sort of
Totally.
tiny retailers that just had nothing, and when they did eventually get something, it was sort of like the template from a WordPress or something like that. Bringing that back to agents, what we found is that our customers do want a personalized experience where the agent actually embodies their brand voice and has their policies enforced. Yeah. And I think that as a consequence, one of the things that we've done is that our model for onboarding a customer includes what we call an agent developer who works very closely with each customer to understand what is it that they want to have their customer experience be, and how do we make that come to life. And so to some extent, and each agent is its own product. And so you have, like a product manager and a developer who are responsible for producing this product on top of Sierra's platform.
You just said something that like this is one of the funny nuances of talking about this topic. Each agent has to kind of have its own PM and engineer. I think when some people talk about these topics, like they're talking about a brand's agent is actually a collection of individual agents, each with kind of a discrete function. When you're saying what you just said, what do you mean? Are you talking about the collective, experience for one of your customers, or each of the functional things like processing a return? how much does each one have its own person or small group of people taking care of it and training it and tuning it?
We don't think about, given a particular company, their agent as being a, collection of sort of coordinating agents.
Yep.
I think at the end of the day, it's just one agent. There is some sort of
Cool.
overlap between sort of the types of cases that an agent can handle from one retailer to another, and they're built on top of abstractions. So there's some amount of leverage that we get from that. We don't, yeah, it's not so much that somebody owns returns holistically across all,
Yeah.
but it's more that each agent has its own set of processes. So, return policies or, the ability to suggest exchanges or other sort of preferences for loyal customers and that kind of thing.
That makes sense, right? I think it's helpful to just clarify work phrasing because we do hear folks talk about collections of agents differently. We know how you're talking about it. One agent per customer with different functions that it does. And each of those can be somewhat custom and based on that customer's needs and desires. What have you found about helping bring those to life? I can imagine there's people that come in with all sorts of different expectations about what's possible, what's going to be involved in training it, what's going to be involved in tuning it. Like you have clearly figured out how to guide people through that. What have you learned about, kind of that path of idea to reality? And I'd love to hear you talk about like how you involve the customer in that. Because I think one of the curious things here is how people that aren't close to building this stuff ramp and learn to set their own expectations about how this stuff's going to work.
I think early on when AI was still fairly sort of new, with ChatGPT just being 2 years old now, a lot of customers would show up and be kind of unsure about what to expect. I think that we've actually seen that start to change fairly rapidly. I mean, if you think about it, it's only been a year. I think customer expectations are starting to be much more grounded in what's happening. In particular, I think early on there was a lot of fear about the AI doing crazy things or sort of having no guardrails.
Right.
And then what we've been able to demonstrate is with our early customers and early interactions with our new customers show that there's actually a lot of control. The guardrails that we're able to put in place with because of our technology actually gives our customer a lot of control over
Yeah.
how the agent behaves and how to what extent it does embody their brand and guidelines. So I think a lot of it is like it being able to actually demonstrate that and show like, hey, this agent is for your company, and so this is how it can behave in order to match what you want.
That process to get it there, like it sounds like you have some amount of, onboarding and alignment that you do with your customers. How much are you involving them in that? How much is your team figuring those things out? Like I'm just kind of curious to get a sense of what that looks like for the people that are building these sorts of products, how much work that takes to get on the same page.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there's probably a little bit of self-selection that happens just by nature of this being used. So I think a lot of the people who are getting engaged with us have a curiosity to be more involved, and so they end up being fairly involved. It's not so much like a fire and forget. They don't send us a set of requirements and then disappear or anything like
Just build
that.
it.
It's
Right.
like almost like for each customer a co-design process. And then in terms of sort of how involved they get, it kind of runs the gambit. And there's some customers who they show up and they're like, "Here's we've architected these. This is how we want the customer experience to be," and we have a ton of work into that. And others that let us pull it out of them, right? Give us some insight into how you think about the customer experience, and we have to ask questions and do a little bit of back and forth to discover. At the end of the day, I think what is most useful is to make it concrete, right? To have sample conversations, to build a prototype of the agent and understand how it interacts, let them test it, do an early pilot with their customers. I think that starts to make it much more, I guess, concrete in the sense that it's actually there and then you have something to react to. If you're only discussing in the abstract, you could probably go on forever. So I think
Yep.
thinking about getting how do you figure out what the simplest use cases to start with, or the ones that sort of help prove the value, and sprinting to making that tangible, I think has been super powerful for us.
Yeah. And that all tracks, right? Like kind of just classic product development stuff that you're talking about there.
Yeah.
You're starting to get into like, what does your product actually do? You mentioned some of the things that you've done, to give people confidence, helping them understand guardrails you put in place, for instance. But would love to hear you unpack as much as you're willing a little bit more about like the anatomy of what you've had to build. Like, what are the pieces of your stack conceptually at least, that help make agents do the right thing, be trustworthy, repeatable, all the things that need to be true to work at scale. I'd love to hear you talk about some of the details for other teams that are building.
This is actually one of the pieces that I'm personally most sort of motivated and passionate about. I think I realized, maybe last year, the process of building an agent, like I said earlier, is kind of like building a product. And that actually like goes deeper than, might be obvious from the surface. I think the analogy
Yep.
that I use is like, if you think about Google in its early days, they not only built a great product in their search engine, but they also got really good at building internet scale products. And
Yeah.
as a consequence, they did that over and over again. Early inventions like MapReduce made that possible. I think the same is going to be true for agents. Specifically at Sierra, we're not only sort of building AI agents for our customers, we're also investing in building the tools and processes and ultimately a product that is
Yep.
the best way to build the best agents. And so it's sort of like the first derivative of a great agent is a great product and building agents. And that's obviously how, maybe not obviously, that's how you and I initially met. As part of that is in the evaluation, which is a very important step in building the tooling for having a great agent. So I think it actually ends up being a fairly deep analogy where everything from the design process. So if you're designing a web product, maybe you use something like Figma to sort of just
Yep.
express what the UI looks like. You actually need a tool to help you design what the conversation looks like with an agent. I think trying to do that with the existing tool doesn't quite work. Conversation is much more complex. There's an infinite number of things that anyone can say at any time. I think the having an idea of like how do you want to design the conversation, how do you want it to go, requires new tools. That's sort of the design phase at the beginning, all the way to monitoring. How do you monitor that your agents are doing the right thing? If it's something like using Web 2.0 analogy, if you just have like a HTTP success rate, that's one level, which obviously you need for an AI agent. But you also have to have an understanding of the content of the conversation and what the customer's experience is. And when the experience is just natural language, that gets a lot more complex. And so building the entire pipeline of design, test, build, QA, monitor, regression tests, and observability, all those things fit into this agent development lifecycle, and making that sort of figuring out the right pieces for all those steps, I think has been both a lot of fun and extremely high leverage.
And you guys have built out this platform. I know you've talked about it publicly as like Agent OS. Is that one to one with what you're describing right now? People that are checking out your website,
Yeah, exactly. I think the Agent OS is all these things sort of come
all the
together
things.
to, yeah.
I mean, I'd love to just like dig a little deeper, maybe just like a baseline question. When people are thinking about building in this space, one of the things I've been seeing is there's a lot of teams that have done something, with a simpler set of prompts. Maybe they're running a chatbot with a basic system message and like a RAG process, which just kind of like got invoked every time, or, they're building a feature that maybe does a couple steps. You all are getting into a much more complex, open-ended, you know, I can imagine a set of things that are happening on the back end, different prompts and tool calling and otherwise. What are just like the core primitives that you found to be helpful to organize, your world, all these different functions that an agent can use? I'd love to just kind of hear you talk about like information architecture as much as you're willing. How do you think about setting up and organizing these systems?
I think when it comes to interacting with the LLMs, like obviously the base unit of going a request response with an LLM is prompt. Often you might just be able to get away with one prompt to in order to sort of have it one end user interaction. I think what we found is that to have a more reliable and steerable interaction, you have to use sequences and a sort of constellation of these things, sort of serving different purposes. And like one mental model that could be useful is, LLMs are, at least today, pretty good at some things. And then as you move sort of into more advanced reasoning or requiring more context, not so much a context window, but just like information theory, they start to veer off. Or if you needed to do sort of like logical reasoning, you probably can get away with like a chain of thought, but then now you've added a bunch of latency. So I think figuring out how to decompose what you're trying to do into a reliable set of steps that LLMs are good at today and then being able to compose that together in a way
Yep.
that can, when you compose them, reliably produce the customer interaction that you want, or the product behavior that you want. That ends up being, a much more effective process than trying to like prompt engineer one giant prompt into doing
Right. Right.
what you want. I think it's that level of like, there's not going to be any silver bullets to like this. Oh, if I just get these prompts right, then everything's going to click into place. That in combination with like, I think for us, because we're building not just one AI product, but each agent is its own product. As a necessity, what we've built is not only these components, but they form abstractions on top of which we build the agents. And so I think depending on whether
Right.
or not, for your listeners, like if you're building one product versus a platform on top of which many products are built, I think trying to figure out how you decompose it into a way that you can get the reliability that you need is probably useful advice.
Maybe like a couple key pieces in there that I bet listeners would be interested to hear more about. You talked about a couple of things like you're calling into customer systems and you want to know if the right thing is happening, right? Are we actually returning this item? Is it all correct? In the example I mentioned earlier, I remember when you and I were first talking about evals, you mentioned the idea of like tool hallucination, right? You have a nice friendly customer support agent that says like, yeah, sure, I'll update your email address for you. It doesn't have access to the tool to make that call. So you get into these weird kind of, hallucinations as you try to take these actions in the world. What does it look like for your team to like test these systems and gain confidence? Like, what have you had to do to figure out if those actions that are happening in the world are the right ones, and do that at scale?
Yeah. This is one of the definitely one of the bigger challenges that we faced. I don't think that we found any one solution. There's a constellation of things or the collection of things that we use to help here. We do manual review, similar to when you call into customer service, even for a human, they might say this call has been recorded for quality assurance purposes. So that definitely is sort of the ultimate backstop, because we can have humans be, the catch there. Then on top of that, I think there's, for each customer, there's certain things that you might want to watch out for. And obviously LLMs can be fairly good at just like answering a basic question like, did the AI, promise something to the customer and not actually deliver that. I think we can because those are simple checks, you can sort of do them at runtime. And so there's this concept of like a supervisor model, which is in the zeitgeist of the industry. And then there's a number of things that, I think we've done to help at runtime catch those things, but they end up being fairly like low level. I think not too dissimilar in structure from a supervisor model, but ultimately there's, many forms it can take.
And a bunch of it is like just probably traditional software testing too. Like, did this API action occur?
The other end of it is like, I think that a lot of folks were, worried about AI actually, taking action in a way that was undesirable. Ultimately, I think that's actually fairly like a well solved problem in technology through just the patterns that have emerged for how you separate, a web browser client versus a server. If you're using sort of any e-commerce website, you can't just like give yourself a free item. And so those kinds of things are fairly simple to architect, which is, the API that the AI has access to has the same sort of contracts as a web browser has to its backend. It's not going to just be able to do whatever you want. The backend enforces the behavior that the customer wants.
I think we're on a dotted line here from, the space of things. How do you test? You mentioned a little bit, I think, LLM as a judge uses in your world, but what have you learned about doing evals of these systems when you're trying to iterate on them and know if they're behaving? Like you mentioned, human review is a fallback or kind of the backstop that's always there.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, like what you could tell us about your eval system, like when you're iterating on a prompt or trying out a new model or introducing new functionality, and you have these multi-step flows that aren't totally directed and linear. How do you all think about doing evals on that system?
Yeah, I think so there's some of the basics that like obviously your product handles as well, where you just need to have a data set where it's labeled correctly and you have an idea of what should happen. I think trying to make it as discrete as possible is useful. So like if you have purely free-form text responses, it gets more and more complicated to really know whether one response is better or worse than another. So trying to figure out how to make it as discrete as possible is useful. On top of that, I think another thing that we've learned is that what changes between models is sort of nuanced. Like over a year ago, then we had an assumption that new models would sort of just be a superset of the old model. In practice, I think that they each have their own nuances. Some things are better, some things are worse. And just to try to figure out how do you quickly determine in which ways is this other model better than the last one, and how to accommodate those strengths and weaknesses. It's kind of weird, maybe akin to like moving from one CPU architecture to another, which obviously has different performance characteristics. And I think it's constantly changing. Like I don't, there's I think O3 just came out the other today or yesterday from OpenAI, and I'm sure it'll have its own quirks. I think having the data set in order to identify those things is important, and then having the tooling to be able to quickly experiment. So I think if you can't experiment, like the learning loop ends up being really slow. You can't push to production and then get the data back. It's got to be like a fast loop. The faster you make it, I think the faster. It's not just about the speed of delivery, but actually like accelerates the pace of learning. And if you learn more, by learning I mean a human, not like machine learning. If you learn more, you'll just be able to get further.
I mean, I want to make some of this as practical as you're willing, right? I think I recognize some of this could be like secret sauce for how you all do things, but this topic of evals, I think we all know that's like critical for the reasons you just described. In a system like yours, where you've got this platform element, you've got customer specific implementation, you talked about some things at a high level, like you want to curate good data sets, or like you need to be able to have evals that you can run in the system. Maybe just to start a little bit into that space, how much is what you're doing platform level versus customer specific? Have you found that you've had to build like customer specific evals and data sets just for them, or do you have some like benchmark that you start with that just operates at the platform level? Again, say as much as you want to. I'm kind of curious like how you organize those parts of the system.
There's no secret nugget or anything that's going to be the linchpin of anything that we talk about here today. In practice, both are required. I think in our experience, we do have a platform level eval where some of the abstractions that we've built need to improve and get more powerful. And so in order to do that, we have to iterate on them. So that requires platform level eval. In addition, it would be kind of reckless, I guess, to have
Yep.
customer agents out in the wild without some sort of assurance of its behavior before it goes representing the company. So we also have company level, we think of them as like, it's not so much an eval, but more of like a test. Like you have a specific behavior that you desire to have happen. Let's make sure that that continues to happen, even as the agent's behavior evolves as you extend it. So
Yeah.
I think
And like, what would an example be? Like, if you think about it at that level, the test that you'd run in a customer scenario versus a platform level eval, like what's an example of one versus the other in your world?
Yeah, I think they're probably most akin to like unit testing and integration testing. I think our evals are closer to unit testing. We have some discrete thing that we're trying to determine from the LLM, and you can have an eval on that. So we have some input and some output, and let's just make sure that continues to happen. On the integration testing side, which is closer to an agent behavior, it's a whole sequence of things, right? When you're having a conversation with an agent, there's dozens of, if not hundreds of LLM calls. There's interaction with external systems. Those can break too, right? Like just like any other software, you got to make sure that those things don't break. And so thinking of that more as an integration test, like what is the end-to-end user journey versus some more discrete LLM interaction.
So the first one is kind of like this prompt, these behaviors on the other side, unit test layer, and then system test. Like this is interesting too. A lot of people in the space are figuring out what is this? Like, are you calling that an eval as well? You're talking about it more like an integration test, but hey, this whole flow, given this question at the top about making a return, like, does it happen at the bottom or not? Is that how you organize things? Kind of like top of the chain, bottom of the chain, what happened? Or like, how do you think about what that test consists of?
Yeah, that's definitely one of them. I hate keep saying like there's multiple answers, but I think maybe someday there will be like a grand unified theory of testing or something. But I think in practice, there's multiple tools in place to help ensure the outcome. So yeah, what you described is correct as part of it. And then in addition, there's you can get more granular. I mean, there are some cases where there's very specific things that we want to have extreme reliability on, in which case it ends up looking like an eval or like a unit test, but it's implemented as the equivalent of an integration test. And so I think the answer is it's
All
all
of
of
the
the
above.
above. Yeah.
Yeah. I was having a conversation with a friend the other day about, like how take like a PR with
Yeah.
Git, right? Like the whole ecosystem 10, 12 years ago didn't have that language. Now we all do. And there's expectations around like, what is that workflow? What are the different things that might happen related to that workflow? Feels like we're looking for a similar version of that with building products around LLMs. There's this sense of a bunch of standard practices are emerging. They don't quite have a clean name like a PR anymore or
Yeah.
yet, but I think everyone's ending up in the same place. I wonder what the standard is going to be a year or two from now.
That's exactly what I was like, I think, alluding to earlier with the whole Google analogy. I think you're right. We are going to develop new standards. They're going to exist. I think enough is changing with, conversational AI that a lot of the existing things break down. Like this happened before too, right? I mean, to some extent, like PR is necessary because code is constantly going to production. In the world of like CDs or software on CDs that go to Gold Master, I'm sure
Yep.
they had, code review to some extent, but they also just like QA'd the hell out of the thing before they made the Gold Master and printed the discs. And so that
Yeah.
was enough. And so I think similarly with AI agents, I think a lot's going to change. I'm pretty like confident that something it's going to be different. I don't know exactly what it'll be. I'm obviously hopeful that we'll be a part of it, but it seems like inevitable. It's going to have new
We're
standards.
still in the very early days, and a lot of it's bespoke. We could keep going on the analogies here. We talked about like this is like the hand coded HTML era of building websites.
Yeah,
The web flow will emerge.
right.
One other kind of tactical thing, and then maybe we can change topics, but you did talk about how important, just kind of human review of data has been. I think a lot of folks know this. Making it work in practice is always kind of tricky, where, or do we have engineers doing this that are really close to what's happening and understand the IO of the system and can make sense of complex traces, or these domain experts that, know what the right answers should be, but maybe a bunch of the other stuff can get confusing. It'd be really interesting to hear you just talk about like, what does human review look like in your world, and how have you made it tractable for the people involved to do it?
I think your observation around domain expert versus technical expert is correct. I think the domain expert is probably the more important one once you have some level of scale. As the technical expert, you are sort of on a more stable foundation. In the early days, you probably do need both, or maybe even more. In the early days, you might need even more on the technical side. For us, as we've scaled, I think the customer knowing what the right customer experience should be is more important, because ultimately you have to give that feedback if the behavior is incorrect because the behavior was not correctly specified.
Yep.
The only person who's going to know that is the person who knows what should happen instead. And then in terms of like how do you make it work, I think ultimately this goes back to my point about needing to build the first derivative is like we have to build the best tooling.
Right.
So the experience of doing these reviews has to be exceptional in order to get it reliably and get high signal. You could try to scale it without that, but ultimately I think having great tooling is high leverage for scale. The multiplier there is totally worth it.
I could probably keep asking you questions. I'm keeping an eye on time, but on that path, like you mentioned just how important the feedback is. What else have you learned about building like a feedback loop? How does that cool, we found something wrong here. Domain experts looking at, you know, the way that a agent flow behaved. What happens next to turn that into a fix? I'm curious what that feedback loop looks like.
Definitely one of the things that we've gone through many iterations on. I think our initial intuition was probably insufficient. It was too simple. I think what we've learned is that having an opinion about the kinds of feedback that you want to collect, and how to act on those things in particular is important. So, like, I guess to use some analogies, I guess I'm a fan of analogies. Like in code review, it's sort of just like, or, Google Doc that you might have, you just have the ability to have a text box. You just type like in sort of freeform English, your feedback. In practice, when an AI agent does something, you know, suboptimally, depending on the kind of error, you kind of want different feedback. So
Yep.
if the tone or the phrasing the agent used was not quite right, just giving the correct phrasing is the most efficient. Then you can just use something like fine tuning to help steer that behavior. But if the error is a little bit more, how do I put it? Like it has more to do with what is the described behavior, like what have we informed the agent to do. You end up needing a lot more detail. It's almost like a spec. As a customer experience person, you almost need to just sort of give a spec. You found a bug in the product. Uh,
Totally.
here's how it should work. And then in that case, it's like giving the detail of where do you get this data from, or these are the business rules, or first you should do this, then you do that. That kind of thing is much more useful. Having it just if you think about like my first answer around just sort of giving the next response, that doesn't quite work because then you end up being like a little bit of whack-a-mole and you go back and forth and it ends up being a worse experience. So I think having an opinion about what are the classes of errors that you want to collect feedback for, and what is the right information that's most useful. So thinking about the end-to-end journey, like when a customer provides feedback, what will you do with it, and having that sort of influence what you end up collecting.
I can imagine some of this starts to get customer specific too. I could keep asking you these questions all day. I think for the sake of time, like just high level thoughts on tactics, maybe to wrap this section up. If you think like give some advice to other teams that are building agents following kind of the work you all have been doing, what have been like the highest leverage decisions that you've made or things that you've built that any other team in this space should like make sure you go spend time on?
I think personally, it's sort of a value of mine that I think has been effective here is to be fairly grounded in like customer specifics. I think it's too
Hmm.
easy to like get in your head too much about what is the right solution to a particular problem in the abstract, but keeping it like hyper focused on sort of one customer or one concrete example of how something should go. And then that helps you build a foundation from which you can now have more informed, intuitive mental model for is like super
Hmm.
powerful. I think just because the space is so new, we need to like build our intuition through concrete experience. Just as, I think we will build a mental model very quickly of how something works. And I think it's just because the stuff is so new, just we have to start over, like back to the basics.
That's a good one. And then what's the counterpoint? If I were to ask you, like, that's a bit of positive advice. Where have you made mistakes or, wished you'd done something differently that other people should avoid? Or maybe even just like spent more time on a topic than you wanted to, right? I think there's all kinds of ways that we learn hard lessons as product teams.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually like evals is a good one. I think we've built evals internally, but I think we built it later than we should have. Going back to what I was saying earlier about like the how fast you learn, I think we would have learned faster if we had evals earlier. So I think that's probably a mistake going, in hindsight, something I would have done differently.
The kind of test driven development analogy is emerging more and more for people building in this space. Like, start with your evals, build from there. We're getting close on time. I'm curious what else, like, parting thoughts. If you're thinking about what the future holds, we've got new models coming all the time, new capabilities. Like, for anybody that's thinking about building agents, like, what else should they be paying attention to in the next couple of years, or maybe staying away from either one of those thoughts? What's your parting advice for this audience?
I think one of the things that I'm excited about looking into the future is like the new product paradigms that will form sort of beyond AI agents, but just to AI, holistically. I think people are going to discover new paradigms for interacting with products that are going to be fairly exciting. Like obviously there's chat with ChatGPT, but you already see a bunch of sort of popular tech companies like Figma and others who are adding AI features. I think no one has like totally cracked the figured out the perfect solution for any of these things yet, and I'm very excited to like see what people come up with. I think it's going to look different than it does today. It's not just going to be like the faster version or the more automated version. It might just completely change the interaction paradigm. Like
Yeah.
my toy example is like, Twitter invented pull to refresh on mobile. That like paradigm is just a UI paradigm, but like it doesn't make any sense on web, like on desktop web, but it becomes native to the mobile experience. And I think similarly with AI, the industry will discover new product paradigms for experiences, and I'm excited to see what it is.
And I saw you all started talking about voice agents recently. Like, there's going to be, I don't know. I'm excited as well, and we'll be watching what you all create because I feel like you're on the front lines here and leading the way in a lot of ways. So well done. Thanks for taking the time to talk with us. And I'll look forward to being in touch more in the future. Appreciate it,
Thank
Arya.
you. Thanks for having me.
Have a great day. See ya.
All right. That's all we have for today's episode of Deployed, the AI Product Podcast. I'm Ian Cairns, CEO and co-founder of FreePlay. I hope you enjoyed listening. And if you did, we'd love to hear about it. Your reviews mean a lot. They help other listeners. So give us a like, share, subscribe, wherever you're listening to this. And if something stood out to you in the episode, or if you've got feedback or ideas for a future episode, or if you simply just want to learn more what we're up to at FreePlay, shoot me a note. I'm Ian at freeplay.ai. You can also find me on Twitter @Cairns. Thanks so much for listening.